Have you ever taken a moment just to stop and look at the background characters in a video game? The ones that are not heroes, nameless, no quests to acknowledge them, they're just around to meander around the stage and sometimes give a text box of dialogue. Comparatively boring clothing, never worth a cosplay. They may not get much attention by the player, yet they are meant to convey a culture or event in ways that add depth to a narrative. An empty street carries its own spooky vibes, and a town needs people. So from a design perspective, how do we condense something as large as a culture and the complexities of real, breathing people and smush it down into a general vibe of background noise? To answer that, I have to talk about how we perceive normality and how we learn what counts as normal in our society and others. So let's get started. I'm Jesse, I'm a sociologist, and I welcome you to Worlds Familiar. In the construction of background characters, we have to consider and balance two different extremes. On the one hand, as individuals, we can only see from our own eyes, hear from our own ears. We only experience things through our own perceptions. We understand that others experience things through their own senses, but we can never experience things as they do. Likewise, we have our own lives and goals, and we know others do as well, but we can't fully experience them or understand them in the same way that we can understand ourselves. As the saying goes, everyone is a hero in their own story. In the abstract, this is fairly easy to understand. However, it gets complicated quickly. There is no way for us to truly know another person. We can't see into another's mind or feel their emotions as they do. We can certainly try, that's what empathy helps with, but there is always a barrier in perception and experience. This results in us always having a limited view or understanding of others, and that affects how we understand people. For instance, let's talk about in-group, out-group effects. People in your in-group can include friends, family, coworkers, generally the people who you would identify as being close to. But it goes beyond that. It can include allegiances, religion, political identity. It is not just a factor of how well you know the people, it is a factor of how you see them, and it is a mental designation for how you categorize them as a person. You don't have to know someone well for them to count as being part of your in-group. But for our purposes, we tend to understand people inside and outside of our group differently. We assume that people socially close to us have a degree of personal depth or complexity. We are more likely to see and consider their goals, virtues, and quirks, and whenever something happens, we tend to mentally account for their circumstances and their relationship to us as we analyze whatever happened. For example, let's say a friend commits a crime. Let's say, for instance, they get into a fight and knocked a guy out. On average, we are more likely to consider the circumstances of the fight and other factors of our friend. It was probably an accident. If they did do it, they must have had a reason for it. We're more likely to still consider them a good person at heart, or otherwise consider their character from outside of the fight. Likewise, we might blame others involved or wave it off as unimportant. Come on, it's just a one-time thing. The other person had it coming. In such situations, we tend to be more willing to spend time and effort understanding what happened for people in our in-group. We're more willing to express forgiveness or mentally counterbalance any bad actions with good actions that we've seen them take or general characteristics that we see as part of their character. In other words, we continue to see them as complex people, and people are allowed to have flaws and still be accepted. It's a reflex we humans have to protect our community and the members inside it from outside forces. And it's a way for us to increase coherency within our community. After all, communities with a lot of infighting don't tend to last as long. So forgiveness is actually part of how we think about it. In contrast, we don't tend to give people outside of our group the same treatment. Again, using crime or knocking someone out as an example, perhaps we see them as doing the crime because they are bad people. We think they didn't have to lash out, and why would they have started the fight anyway? Maybe they deserve punishment. And maybe we don't stop at just that individual. Maybe we include others who were around them and consider them just as bad. Why didn't any of them stop it from happening? Maybe they're all guilty. There is less consideration of context, more latching onto assumptions, and more willingness to jump to broad generalizations for people outside of our group. In other words, we put less mental effort into trying to understand how people outside of our groups could be complex creatures. But to circle back around, I bring this up because this means that the bar for good background characters is actually pretty low. We already simplify outgroups, so our average player expectations will play into that to an extent. Not to say that you can get away with anything, as it's not hard to tell when an NPC budget is less than a jar of pickles, but it does mean that gamers will be evaluating on a curve, and that also means that good background characters have a lot of potential to exceed expectations. And I also bring this up since whenever we're trying to draw up a fictional culture, what knowledge are we using exactly? Even though we generally understand that people are complex, we can also fall back on simplified understandings of any group, especially those outside of our own if we're not careful. So unless you're writing a culture that perfectly matches your own, you're probably going to have to do a degree of research and consider what kind of people live in that culture. Background characters in games don't have to be complex like real people, but they still have to be interesting enough to convince us that there is some culture there. Likewise, it's important to avoid oversimplifications and even stereotypes that we may have picked up about people outside of our group. So with that in mind, I think there are three major considerations in determining what makes a good set of background characters, and these would be appearance fit, balancing diversity and commonality, and accent activities and events. Let's start with appearance fit, since it's fairly obvious on the surface. If you want to make an area set in modern Yokohama, Japan, then you would expect a lot of Japanese people with appropriate clothing. Likewise, if you want to show the hometown of a bunch of anthropomorphic forest bunnies, then having such forest bunnies populate the area is probably a solid start. But I think just looking at the end result is a lot less interesting than considering how we get there. To show what I mean, let me ask for a bit of mental participation. Let's say that you're a game developer, and the boss comes in and asks you to mock up a small cast of background characters for a new area. He gives you the details for the area, and the area is supposed to be lower class, a futuristic setting, punkish, but it's not in the main part of the city. So with those traits alone in mind, what kind of people do you imagine? How old are they? Do they trend towards teenagers or adults? Are there any children or elderly people in the mix? What about race? White, Hispanic, Black, Asian, which is most common in your depiction, and how racially diverse is it? And what does punk look like to you anyway? Do you imagine it's cybernetics, high on drugs, lots of piercings, or is it just like Hot Topic t-shirts? Whatever you imagine, it is going to be based on knowledge that you've already accumulated from somewhere. And I mean that honestly. What is occurring here is the result of socialization that you have experienced throughout your life. So as we go through our lives, we are taught expectations of what traits go together. If you imagine something like what poverty looks like, then you are tapping into what you have been taught about that concept. And I'm not talking about just taught in a classroom. I'm talking about what you have learned from anywhere in your life. Whatever your mental image is, it will have been thrown together in part as a collage of information that you have learned from school, from family members, from things you've seen on TV or in video games, advertising, on the news, and kind of anywhere else. And what we perceive may not always be accurate to reality. What I mean by this is, for instance, I love Yakuza Like a Dragon, and I think it gives a really well thought out depiction of homelessness, desperation, and crime. But at the same time, it shows the main character Ichiban working his way out of poverty absurdly quickly, through enthusiasm, hard work, and a fair bit of dumb luck. Which is great for the story, but not at all accurate to reality. And while I asked for interpretations of poverty, the same could be asked for anything from sports, to religion, to ancient history. We've all learned something about those topics at minimum from cultural osmosis, but that doesn't mean the information is going to be correct. So always check your sources. You don't want to be the person who falls back on stereotypes and oversimplifications. But let's move on to balancing diversity and commonality with background characters. To start, any population will have variation, whether it be things like physical appearance, social standing, skill sets, or anything else. However, that variation will exist within a cultural framework. Making a well-developed background cast will take a consideration of contrasting elements of what will be common in society, what will be less common in that society, and what will be the extreme that society will still allow. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a great example of showing this in action. In any town that you come across, there's a general vibe that goes through the entire town. Nibelheim is a depressed medical hamlet, Gold Saucer is sensory overload for the wealthy, and Corel is poor as dirt. But that's just the surface level, and the details in the towns are just wonderful. For instance, Corel, not just poor as dirt, the people here have solid diversity. Various races, a few kids running around, people with different levels of ability, and they even have a line for a soup kitchen hidden in a corner, which just by level design would suggest that it is something people didn't want to have in a more public space. which suggests there is some shame, shyness, or hesitation associated with going to the soup kitchen, which would be expected for an area like this. Clearly a good chunk of thought was put here. Aside from that, a recurrent theme is that people are stressed or angry about the situation they're in. Makes sense. But they are reacting in different ways. Some are venting their frustrations via the long-known and not very useful method of the barroom fight, while others take the classic route of seeking the bottoms of various bottles. But others don't take that route. In the center of town, there's a group listening to a planetologist, either trying to distract themselves from their reality or trying to take a bigger picture look on faith or what's going on in the world. Then you have another guy back away from the crowds just taking swings with his baseball bat, talking to himself about how members of his family had succeeded and how he would make it big himself. He is still showing frustration, but he's throwing himself at what he sees as a solution to his part of the problem. So there are similarities through shared problems with unemployment, but diversity in the town and individual reactions and ambitions. That makes it a pretty good example. And the other towns are just as good. Nibelheim has the oppressive vibe of a makeshift hospital, but there are also adults over in the corner doing yoga, and a bunch of kids still playing and finding their own victories. The town may come across as depressing to an outsider, and it certainly is depressing to characters like Cloud or Tifa, but that doesn't stop the townsfolk from finding their own joy here. And to note, this variety can still be important even in more fantastical cultures. Case in point, here's reason number silly why Claire Obscure Expedition 33 is stupidly good. Gestrels. Gestrels? I think it's Gestrels. The first time you meet the Gestrels, it takes about 2 seconds to figure out that their entire culture is defined by love of battle and frequent mercantilism. Those two characteristics are shown as extremely common, but not universal. Their hometown reflects this, being about 90% markets and arenas by volume. This is fine. Perfectly fair for a fantasy town of rock'em sock'em merchants. Outside that though, there is one random guy off in the corner of town going against social expectations and trying to build a casino. This casino kid has goals, but they are not shared by the town and there is no quest for him. My first thought when I first saw Casino Kid was that, oh, there will be a casino later in the game. But there never is one. The casino never opens. This is just a Gestrel that wants a casino, but never gets there. So why include him? This might be a generous reading, but I like to think that his presence shows more about Gestrel culture. A society of any real size will have people that they view as deviant, as not matching their culture's values or social norms, whatever they may be. And Casino Kid would definitely count for that. His existence shows how Gestrels are keeping away, functionally ostracizing the would-be gambler magnate without directly condemning him. In addition, the Gestrel leader Golgra will absolutely police Gestrels for going too far outside of the expectations of their town, or at least breaking the laws of it, but she never does with Casino Kid. He's not breaking the formal rules, but he is just breaking the folkways. This results in the feeling that the treatment the Casino Kid receives is less from hostility and more stemming from the Gestrel's tendency for childishness. A kind of playground logic. That kid wants to play weird games, so I don't want to play with him. Does this extra definition with Gestrel culture contribute to the adventures of Expedition 33? Not too much, at least not directly. Does it help the world feel more alive and vibrant? Absolutely. For the development cost of one alcove and a few lines of dialogue, it adds a lot of contrast to the town. And I'm still wondering what supernatural contract the developer signed to make this game with such a small crew. But that's another thing. Anyway, let's move on to part 3. So we have people with goals. What do? Let's move on to activities and background events. I like to think of these as the general motion that background folk take whenever you're just going around your business. It's perhaps obvious to note, but people are fidgety. You don't need a scientist to point out that difference. So it's pretty standard to have a few people walking around or vaguely motioning in the direction of tables or items. That's a very basic example, but it can be taken so much further. A favorite example of mine is a single event that happens in a linear story. For this, I would like to bring your attention to Paper Mario and the Thousand-Year Door. Right at the start of the game, you hop off your boat, get dogpiled by astronauts, then go into the town square to try and meet up with Princess Peach. Pretty standard Paper Mario fare so far. Princess Peach isn't around, you meet up with a friendly Goomba, and start talking. Text boxes, protagonists chatting, generally not doing much. Except, what's going on back there? Is that Goomba getting mugged? Oh, is he okay? Okay, he got back up. So, yeah. Moving on, I guess. So the first time I played this game, I never noticed that scene in the back since I was reading through the story. Mario and Goombella only briefly turn to see it and then go right back to their conversation. It's literally happening in the background. Yet, if you do notice it, it is a treat. It tells so much about what Rogueport is like, and how crime is a factor for the people here, and it gives a bit of slapstick humor. The scene is never relevant to the story, but it shows that while Mario is the hero, he is not central to every event in the town. Honestly, I'm surprised we don't see scenes like this in games more often. It helps the world feel more lived in. I'm sure we've all had moments in store, or at a park, or in another public venue where we saw something happen to someone else. And I think it's good to have something like that happen in video games too, whether it be to add to the lore about a place or just add a bit of whimsy. A lot can be done by letting the camera drift away from the protagonists for a few seconds. Often games try to make main characters so special that they stand apart from everyone else. And while I understand that there is a desire to be special, I fear that stories can be lost in the pursuit of it. It kind of sucks all the air out of the room for everything else. Background characters don't need to be bland. And honestly, once they become too interesting, they stop feeling like background characters. I hesitated to even bring up a few games when talking about this topic because the characters involved didn't feel like they were part of the background. For instance, the villagers in Stardew Valley or Animal Crossing, even the folks around town in Deltarune. They're given enough detail and focus that they don't really feel like they're part of the stage dressing. They're part of the performance. And especially in long-form media like video games, I think there's room for more than one story. It is too easy to simplify how we view other people, to reduce them to caricatures while only caring about those people near us. We are socialized to do just that, to focus on our own groups and repeatedly told narratives and shown images that rarely focus on the full story of others. And it is too easy to take shortcuts and fall back onto such oversimplifications when we are writing our own stories. But doing so crafts a world less interesting. The real world is stupid complicated, and lived reality makes messy stories. But not every event will affect us directly, and I think there is a kind of beauty in showing that in the art we make, letting smaller characters have their own place on the stage. But aside from that, I'm curious, what do you all think? Any favorite interactions with background characters, or feelings of certain games that did background characters and smaller characters particularly well? Let me know in the comments. And if you don't mind, maybe hit that subscribe and like button. The channel is still new, so I'd appreciate any assistance with spreading the word about it. Y'all have a good one.